What if I told you that there's an order of trans girl priestesses who practiced in the ancient Mediterranean for 1,000 years, and that I've got the evidence to prove it, and that this time I'm not talking about the Enarees? Have I got your attention yet? Previously on this channel, we talked about the Gallae, an order of transgender priestesses in Rome who originally came from the Near East, just like the Enarees did. Turns out there are a lot of trans feminine priestesses who came from the Near East. I haven't even covered all of them on the channel yet. Maybe there's a connection. I don't know. I haven't found one yet, but I will. One of these days. At least, that's what I'm telling myself. The Gallae were the devotees of the goddess Kybele, who originated in Phrygia, central Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, before making their way to the Roman Republic. We've done a general overview of them already, which you can find in a previous video on the channel. I'll probably link it around there somewhere. But the more I get into these topics, the more I realize there's just too much information to cover in a single video. Besides, people frequently have questions about these topics after the fact, and I try to be thorough, but I can't possibly think of everything, so we're jumping into the Gallae again. If you're new to this channel, welcome. I'm Sophie, and this is We Have Always Existed. It's a show where we explore the wealth of transgender histories in the ancient Mediterranean. If you're new to the topic of the Gallae, you may want to watch the previous video first. I'll do my best to keep this self-contained, but you may have some questions at the end, which that previous video will hopefully answer. And if it doesn't, and even if it does, honestly, ask them in the comments below. Maybe the answer will warrant another video. But one thing I didn't cover much in detail is what we know of the spiritual practices of the Gallae themselves. I know the idea of better understanding the rituals of ancient trans priestesses is important to a lot of you. More than a few times I've had various trans pagans show up in my comments and in my email inbox wanting to know more. Believe it or not, that was never my goal. Not explicitly, at least. I'm a classicist, first and foremost. My interest is in the history, literature, archaeology, language, and culture of the ancient Mediterranean. But you can't control how people find inspiration in your work, and that's part of the beauty of creating. You also can't control which work people find inspiring. For example, I thought the videos on Hypsicrates and Pelagius were some of my best work, but the analytics tell a different story. What are you gonna do? My transmasc videos just don't do the numbers. Trans guys, you wanna see more transmasc history? I'd love to tell it, but you've gotta do your part too. Share these stories with your bros. I can't pay the bills when the video's a dud. Anyway, what do we know about the worship practices of the Gallae? Well, a lot, and not a lot at the same time. After the rise of Christianity, many of the rituals and practices of pagans in the Mediterranean were lost, so we don't have like a how-to guide or anything. But at the same time, the cult of Kybele and the worship practices of the Gallae had been going on in the Mediterranean for like 1,000 years, perhaps more. That's not the sort of thing that you can permanently erase, no matter how hard you try. So we can still piece together a picture based on the elements that do survive, which is what we'll be doing today. Much like a puzzle you buy from a thrift store, that picture is going to have a lot of gaps in it, but at least it's something. As best we can, we're going to explore the worship practices of the Gallae, as well as what we know of ancient mystery cults in general. From there, I'm hoping we can piece together something vaguely approaching some actual spiritual practices. We'll do what we can, but I'm sure I'll be missing some details. But, and I know you've heard me say this plenty of times before, at the moment this is the longest script I've ever written. So look, I'm not going to be able to cover every single little minute detail, but that just means there's lots more content for you all to badger me to make in the future. Speaking of which, the idea for this video comes from one of the channel's Patreon backers, Kate Wood. So thanks, Kate. If you'd like to support the channel, there's a link to the channel's Patreon in the description. Hundreds of hours of work go into each of these videos, and your support makes a big difference in helping me continue to make it for you. As well, if you like speculative near-future sci-fi, you may be interested in my novel, The Bottom Line, which has been called, quote, a surprisingly comforting read for dealing with feelings of hopelessness, obsolescence, helplessness, and directionlessness. As I read this, my novel will soon be unavailable. My publisher is unfortunately closing up shop. But if you're watching this in the future, I'll have republished it myself, so check it out. I don't want to pitch it too hard since you're all here for trans history, not sci-fi, but it's hard to make it as a writer these days, and you guys are the widest audience I've got, so, if you like the work I do, your support helps me keep doing it. Without further ado. Chapter 1. Misconceptions and Definitions. Before we dig too far into this, I want to take a moment to talk about definitions. I mentioned the phrase mystery cult earlier, and look, I know where your brain is going. You're probably thinking of weirdo groups that isolate their members from their communities and families, centered around an unhinged authoritarian leader who demands absolute loyalty as well as financial support, who creates an us versus them mentality between the cult members and society at large, who's preoccupied with money, who encourages antisocial behaviors that further isolate members from their previous communities, and who punishes anyone who wants to leave. Things like MAGA, the Church of Scientology, Free Domain Radio, or the Heaven's Gate cults. Did you know the Heaven's Gate website is still online, by the way? It's such a wild little piece of internet history, dark though its origins and results may be. So, the word cult has a lot of messy connotations in the modern world, but let's hit the brakes. That's not what we're about today. As it turns out, language evolves, and the ways we use words in the past aren't the same as how we use them today. For example, take the word dictator. In the days of the Roman Republic, dictator, in Latin, was an official government position. In times of great crisis, a dictator would be appointed for the duration of the crisis or for 6 months, whichever was shorter. He had much broader control over the state, but his job was to resolve the present crisis and then resign his office. In fact, one of the most revered figures from the early Republic was Lucius Quinctius Cincinnatus, who was a political and military leader that retired and became a farmer. During a war with the Aequi, Cincinnatus was asked to become a dictator to deal with the crisis. He defeated them in 16 days, then laid down his dictatorial power and went back to being a humble farmer. That wasn't a job you gave to just anybody. They had to have great moral character. It wasn't a problem until Julius Caesar declared himself dictator perpetuo, perpetual dictator, which is when he began his new career as a senatorial knife holder. So dictator didn't have the same meaning in ancient Rome as it does today. The same is true for the word cult. Cult just refers to ancient practices in worship of a particular god. We'll get more into that later in the video, but ancient mystery cults weren't creepy in the way that we think of cults today, at least not to the people of their day, mostly. It's been pretty difficult for scholars to piece together the details of the ancient mystery cults, so in many ways they are a mystery to us, but that's not why we call them mystery cults. That's just a coincidence. In general, mystery cults were secretive in that their practices were closed off to the general public. In Greek, the word for mystery cult is mysterion, and once you were initiated, you were a mustes. We don't know the etymology of these words, but the Greek word muein means to close, so some scholars think that might be related. After all, you weren't supposed to talk about the goings-on in your mystery cult. Keep your mouth closed about it. The first rule of mystery cults, blah, blah, blah. We also need to toss out our idea of what a religion is. If you're watching this video based on my analytics, it's a good bet you were raised in an Abrahamic religion, or at least in an area where an Abrahamic religion was culturally dominant. So you're used to a religion that has a sacred text as the central authority for things. But pre-Christian pagan religions didn't have that. The closest thing they had to a central text was Homer and Hesiod, but these weren't exactly holy texts. Other mythographers deviated from their ideas all the time, and nobody showed up at their door with pitchforks and torches. There were temples to the gods, of course. The most famous one is probably the Parthenon, the temple to Athena on the Acropolis at Athens, but there are plenty more of them. But it wasn't the sort of thing where you'd attend service once a week like a church. Rather, you'd spend a lot of time thinking about your relationship to the gods on a daily basis. But the God of Abraham is mostly, don't at me, considered to be a loving, caring God who wants the best for his followers. The Torah, the Bible, and the Quran are full of moral lessons to help teach you how to be a better person. Amid all the messed up junk I know, don't at me. With stories about pagan gods, sometimes the moral lesson is that the gods are petty assholes, and they're going to ruin your life just because they feel like it. People were still devoted to the gods to varying degrees, just like they are today. But that might not necessarily save you from an awful fate. For example, are you an ancient Greek with epilepsy? If so, your seizures wouldn't be considered a result of abnormal brain activity like we understand them to be today. Instead, it would be because the god Pan seized you and started violently shaking you. That's why we call it a seizure. It might also be because the moon goddess Selene cursed you and made you crazy, which is where we get the term lunatic from. Lunatic? Get it? What about a crop failure? Somebody must have done something to upset Demeter, the goddess of the harvest. Was there an earthquake or a tsunami? That's because the earth shaker Poseidon was in a kerfuffle about something. Tides go in, tides go out. You can't explain that. Must have been Poseidon.
Tide goes in, tide goes out.
And if you see someone or something struck by lightning, that's Zeus's handiwork right there. Maybe lightning strikes the CN Tower so often because Zeus thinks it's amusing. You don't know. You can't explain it. Maybe it's Thor on top of Mount Olympus.
Thor on top of Mount Olympus.
This guy always bugged me. I don't know where he comes across being so smarmy about this. Thor didn't live on Mount Olympus. It's a completely separate mythology. Zeus threw lightning bolts from Mount Olympus. Thor lived in Asgard. I can't believe I'm taking Bill O'Reilly's side in an argument. Anyway, you do your best to honor the gods in the hope that they'd bestow favor upon you. And sometimes they would, but sometimes they did destructive things because they were angry. And sometimes even their most devoted humans would be caught in the middle of it. So let's recap. Mystery doesn't mean mystery, cult doesn't mean cult, and religion doesn't mean religion. Forget everything you know about these words. In fact, forget every word you know. Forget English altogether. These aren't words. They're just sounds. Mraw, mraw, mraw.
Flyboid florx venatrio, brecacacax, coax, simlanschlorps, henschlitz.
Chapter 2. Gaze into the eyes of our ancient sister. When it comes to understanding the cult practices of the Gallae, one of the best examples we have is a funerary portrait of a Gallae priestess. I'd actually come across this statue before, but I think I kind of just brushed past the fact that we have an actual sculpture of one of the Gallae, which is pretty incredible. So let's take a moment to look more closely. A while back, we explored the grave goods of an Enaree priestess from modern-day northern Afghanistan. We had a chance to look through her stuff and even got to see an illustration of her actual body lying in the grave. If you saw that video, you know how exciting it was. But we didn't get a chance to see what her face might have looked like. With this sculpture, we do. And here she is. You and I, all of us right now, are gazing into the face of one of our trans sisters. It dates to the 2nd century CE. If that doesn't strike you with an enormous sense of awe, may I suggest you check to make sure you still have a pulse. In fact, if you don't think this is awesome, you're probably on the wrong channel. Go ahead, unlike, uncomment, unsubscribe, unsign up for Raid Shadow Legends, unplug your computer, throw it into the ocean, and run off screaming into the forest, never to return. In fact, I might join you. I could use a digital detox. This funerary portrait is about 1.2 meters tall and wide, and was supposedly found at a site called Lanuvium, which is about 30 kilometers southeast of Rome, though it's possible it may have been found in Rome itself. It was donated to the Capitoline Museum back in 1737 by a wealthy family that had holdings in Italy all over the place, which makes its provenance difficult. That really sucks because, based on what I can tell, this portrait is one of two different things. It does resemble what we see on the sides of tombs. The Romans buried their dead along the road outside the city's walls, which was an ancient tradition that spread across the empire. Some of the better preserved graves have sculptures that seem pretty similar. One could easily imagine our Gallae portrait on the side of a tomb like one of these two, the tombs of Gaius Calventius Viotus in the foreground and Naiwalea Tike. I've seen our Gallae referred to as a tomb portrait. I took a trip down to the Royal Ontario Museum to take a video of this funerary marker that's part of their collection there. Its display is mostly text, but one could imagine our Gallae portrait in a similar location. It's also been described as votive, which might imply it was part of an altar to the goddess, and one could also imagine this being part of an altar like this one as well. Either way, this leaves us with a lot of questions. Was this a tomb marker for the grave of a Gallae priestess? In some ways it seems unlikely, since the Gallae were often spoke of derisively in literature. But then, that logic makes a carefully, beautifully sculpted piece like this unlikely in the first place. Ancient writers often spoke derisively about the cult practices of the Gallae, but this portrait has all of it displayed proudly. If this was a tomb marker, what other wonders might we have found inside of that tomb? Or if it's part of an altar, what else might we have found in that area? What else might we have learned about the Gallae and their rituals? Unfortunately, we don't know. This is still an incredible find for trans history in its own right, to be sure, though. It dates to the 2nd century CE, I think I mentioned that already, which is the 100s, which makes this the oldest portrait of a trans person I've found so far, perhaps the oldest one, period. But it can also tell us a lot about the elements of the rituals our ancient sisters used in the worship of their goddess. As far as we know, the Gallae never wrote down the specifics of their cult worship, and if they did, it doesn't survive today. But this portrait is like the next best thing. Paired with the literary evidence we have and some other archaeological evidence, we can build a pretty clear picture of what the religion of the Gallae was like. Let's take a closer look at them. Chapter 3. Ancient Trans Girl Fashion. Let's start with her clothes. What's she wearing? It all just seems like a bunch of robes, so you might assume she's wearing a toga. But the toga wasn't the only piece of clothing Romans wore. In fact, it was really only men and prostitutes who wore togas. Non-prostitute women would wear a different garment, a stola. I know they look pretty similar. Both of them are just kind of drapey cloth, but they were worn differently. It's hard to tell by looking at ancient sculptures, but a toga wouldn't actually cover your whole body. Instead, you'd wear a tunic underneath, and the toga would only cover part of it. For an example of what I mean, here's a photo from the Royal Ontario Museum's Wear a Toga Activity Day. See what I mean? Man's plaid shirt there makes it much more obvious how a toga would have fit. Looking at our Gallae portrait, it's clear that's not what she's wearing. To get a better look of how a stola would have been worn, here's another sculpture of a Gallae priestess, which again I just kind of glazed over in the original video. Two of our ancient sisters, their faces, their styles, their practices, and we get to experience them 2,000 some odd years later. It's beautiful stuff. Maybe trans girls will be watching my videos in the year 4000. Who knows? By then, though, we'll probably have invented some other way to experience media, like data crystal uplinks to the hyperweb via an anti-attenuator frequency harmonic. Don't look at me like that. It makes perfect sense. This bit is going to slay a couple millennia from now, trust me. Unfortunately, I can't find a better photo of this piece. It's supposedly in the Capitoline Museum in Rome, but I looked all through the place and I couldn't find it anywhere. Maybe I missed a spot. The place is pretty labyrinthine. But it might be that she's just not on display, maybe because of how Italians have always been annoying prudes about anything to do with sex or gender. But then again, there are statues with dinks, snatches, and boobs fully exposed for all the world to see throughout the museum. Nobody ever said Italians made any sense. Anyway, this girl's outfit is also a stola. Compare it with the sculpture of Livia Drusilla, the life of Augustus, and with this sculpture of Aulus Metellus, a 1st century BCE senator. The Gallae's outfit clearly resembles Livia's more. Besides, we're told they dress like women. Marcus Terentius Varro described a scene of the Gallae doing their thing and says they were, quote, decked out in charming stolas. So this ancient fashionista would have been seen as wearing women's clothing. But what about what's on her head? It's sort of a turban tiara combination thing. I guess some of them had ear flaps they tied under their chin, but I don't see that on either of our portraits. There are some little plaques with portraits in the tiara, and I know it's hard to see, but these are portraits of Jupiter and of Attis, an important figure in the mythology of Kybele, which we're going to get more into later. Attis is also on her little chest plaque, and it's hard to tell if that's a necklace or if it's pinned to her stola. And her hair? That's a bunch of ribbons tied into her long curling locks, a distinctly feminine style. In general, Roman women had longer hair than Roman men did, just like today. But also no self-respecting Roman man would spend his time weaving ribbons into his hair like a woman.
Like a woman.
In fact, the Roman historian Suetonius even pointed this out when criticizing Nero. Quote, "He was so very shameless in his concern for dress and the care of his person, that he would always have his curls arranged in a pile on his head, and in his trip to Greece even had them flowing down behind." It was notable and weird for Nero to have long hair, or to spend any time making it look nice. That was a passive, feminine activity, not befitting of a proper Roman man. They probably didn't wipe their either, because self-care is feminine, apparently. But clearly our two gals here had no interest in performing masculinity. So let's recap. Ancient trans girls wore women's clothing and hairstyles and jewelry. We're told they wore makeup as well, but that doesn't really come through in the portrait we have. Where'd they get their drip? They went door to door asking for clothes and donations in exchange for telling fortunes. So trans girls have always been into thrifting, I guess. Embracing their femininity was part of their ritual. Clearly. Otherwise, why do it? Well, you and I know why. of course. Chapter 4. Ancient trans girls loved noise music too. There are some musical instruments depicted on our sculpture, including some percussion instruments, and as a drummer myself, I'm particularly excited to check them out. Now, as we mentioned back in the original video on the Gallae, the goddess we'll be referring to as Kybele goes by many names. The earliest inscription we have of her comes from Phrygia, where she's referred to as Matar Kubilea, which means Mother of the Mountains in the Phrygian language. That's clearly where Kybele comes from. But she's also referred to as Meter-Tea, the Mother Goddess, and as Meter-Teos, the Mother of the Gods. Mater Magna, the Great Mother, and so on. Further, her myth was conflated with the other mother gods as well, like Rhea and Demeter. We're going to stick with Kybele though, just to keep things simple. Kybele has her origins in Phrygia, so it's not surprising we see evidence of her worship in the parts of the Greek world closest to there. There are depictions of her in places like Smyrna and Miletus on the west coast of Asia Minor, dating back to the 6th century BCE. From there, it spread, and by the 4th century BCE, we find devotions to her in pretty much every Greek city. Her first significant appearance in literature, though, comes from the Homeric hymns. The Homeric hymns are a collection of poems written in epic style, which were traditionally attributed to Homer. But we're pretty sure it wasn't Homer who wrote them, yada yada yada, that old song and dance. We've been down this road before. For some reason, we don't call the writer Pseudo-Homer, though. They all have different dates, but the general consensus is that most of them were written roughly around the time of Homer, which was the 600s or 500s BCE. Now, the Gallae portrait we looked at is from the 2nd century CE, which is several hundred years later. We really don't know much about the specific rituals the Gallae had when they started in Phrygia or when they moved to Greece. Even the sources we have in the Roman Republican era are pretty sparse. It's only during the imperial period, which is in the modern era, the CE years, that we get more detailed stories about them. But even though this is several hundred years before the portrait we looked at, as you'll see, there are still some parallels. The Homeric hymn to the Mother Gods is pretty short, so I'm just going to read the whole thing. It reads, quote, I prithee, clear-voiced muse, daughter of the mighty Zeus, sing of the mother of all gods and men. She is well pleased with the sound of rattles and of timbrels, with the voice of flutes, and the outcry of wolves and bright-eyed lions, with echoing hills and wooded coombs. And so hail to you in my song, and to all goddesses as well. What does this tell us about Kybele, and about the worship of her? Well, she likes noise. First of all, the Homeric hymn to Kybele, Homeric hymn 14, by the way, talks about a number of different musical instruments. 3 of them are depicted in the portrait we looked at a moment ago, but do we know what these instruments were actually like? Actually, yeah, we do, and it's really cool. Let's take a look. The flute referred to is something called an aulos, which is a sort of double flute. You can see the woman in the background playing it here in this mosaic from Pompey's House of Cicero. The Romans called them tibiae, and if you know your anatomy, you might recognize that as the name of the larger bone in your lower leg, your shin bone. I'm going to keep calling it an aulos though, just to keep it simple. These were more popular in ancient Greece than Rome, but the Romans did have them as well, as we can see in that mosaic from Pompeii. Besides, the Gallae came from the east anyway. The Romans did have other types of flutes though, including panpipes and even bagpipes, but the Homeric hymn specifically uses the term aulos. So I assume that's what they used. Now, sometimes people played 2 auloi of the same size, but sometimes it was 2 different sizes. You'd have a bass flute, which you played with your right hand, and a treble flute, which you played with your left. If we look at the Gallae portrait, it's clear she has 2 different auloi, not the same size. There is a lot about these things that we don't know. Since most of them would have been made of wood or reeds, only a few metal ones have survived. And of those, most of them are smashed, and the couple that are in decent condition don't have any mouthpieces, so we don't really know how they would have been played. Modern reconstructions of them have to take some creative license, but they do their best, and they end up sounding like a mix between a harmonica, a clarinet, an accordion, and an air raid siren. According to the poet Pindar's 12th Pythian ode, Athena invented the aulos because she wanted something that would mimic the wails of the Gorgons Euryale and Theno after their sister Medusa was beheaded by Perseus. And yeah, I hear it. So, if you think of a flute, you're probably thinking of the bright chipper sound you get from a modern flute, but that's not what we're talking about. This translation refers to rattles and timbrels, but that doesn't really do these things justice. I've seen timbrel translated as tambourine and drum, and rattles as castanets, clappers, and cymbals, but that still doesn't really give us much of a picture of these things, because the way the Romans had them is different than the way we have them today. So let's take a look at some of the different percussion instruments the Romans had and compare them with some modern instruments. To do that, we're going to head over to my drum kit. Come on, let's go check it out. All right, here we are. So we'll start with their cymbals. You can see a pair of them in our Gallae portrait connected with a rope or a strip of leather. In some ways, they look pretty similar to what you might think of as a cymbal today. Like this. This is my crash cymbal. And just like my crash cymbal, the ancient ones are round and have a small hole in the center from which you'd suspend it. They also have a bell in the middle with a bow surrounding it. And just like my crash cymbal, the ancient ones were made of bronze, but they weren't played the way most cymbals are played today. When you think of a cymbal, you probably think of it in terms of its place on a drum kit. I know I do. But what we think of as the modern drum kit didn't begin to coalesce until the mid-1800s. Before then, cymbals were played by a cymbal player who most often would strike the two of them together. That's how the Romans played them too. But they were also a lot smaller. For example, this is my rise cymbal. It's the largest cymbal on my kit. It's 51 centimeters in diameter. And here's my splash, which is my smallest cymbal. It's 25 centimeters. It's about half the size. If you live in one of those backward countries that uses a far sillier measurement system, by the way, 1 foot is just over 30 centimeters. The Gallae portrait we have isn't necessarily to scale, so let's take a look at another picture. Here are some Roman cymbals, which are 11 centimeters in diameter, so less than half the size of my splash. I know it's kind of hard to get an idea from a photo, so here's the lid of my hand cream, which is 10 centimeters in diameter, so these cymbals would be slightly bigger than that. See? They're in the Cairo Museum. Here's another pair. These are the largest ones I've been able to find. They're just over 20 centimeters in diameter, so still a bit smaller than my splash. They're in the Met in New York. Let's take another look at that mosaic we looked at earlier. This gives us an example of how these cymbals would have been played. But here's another example. This is a sculpture of a satyr playing cymbals with baby Dionysus on his shoulder. You can tell it's Dionysus because of the grapes, and I know you can't see it here, but this statue has a small tail above his butt, so yeah, it's a satyr, just a more handsome satyr than what we usually see. This one is in the Museo Archeologico Nazionale in Napoli, Italy. It looks like he's playing the cymbals Turkish style, which is where your arms move together in the opposite direction when you strike them together. That changes the sound. If you watch cymbal players in an orchestra, they'll often play them that way. They also use cymbals in other instruments too. Here's one called a skabellum, which was called a kroupalon or kroupezion in Greek. Here's a sculpture of a satyr playing one, along with an aulos. It's essentially 2 blocks of wood with metal inside them. You'd have a sandal that attached to your foot, and then tap it to keep the beat. In between the 2 wood blocks, you'd have tiny little cymbals that would tap together to make the sound. Here's another cymbal-related instrument they used, a krotalum or krotalon in Greek. I know that sounds similar to the kroupalon we just talked about, but it's not quite the same thing. These were essentially clappers with 2 cymbals attached to sticks. They were played mostly by women and used as part of a dance. These particular clappers are in the British Museum. Okay, so that's cymbals. What about drums? Drums are usually made of more perishable material, wood and leather. So of course it's hard for something like that to last very long. The best depiction we have of them is from that awesome mosaic from Pompeii we looked at a moment ago, so let's bring that one up again. Nice. So based on this, we can see the drum is pretty wide and pretty shallow, and you play it with your hand. Compare that with my floor tom here, which is 38 centimeters deep, has legs, and is played with a stick. The closest thing to this I have on my kit is probably my snare. Oops. Oh my god. Maybe this is a bad idea. But even then, it's much deeper than the one we see in that mosaic. It really doesn't seem like a tympanum and a kit drum have much in common. In fact, it seems to have more in common with a tambourine if you remove the jingles. Was there skin on both sides of a tympanum or just one? We don't know. There are plenty of different types of drums that have both. For example, the drums on my kit, of course, they have both, but a djembe only has skin on one side. And we don't have any schematic drawings of Roman drums that would help. Now here's where it gets a little weird. See, we do have parts of a drum that survived from the Roman era, and as far as I know, it's the only one we have. It was dug up in 1968 in eastern France near Strasbourg. The resident of the grave was around 20 years old and probably died in the 3rd century CE. This is a photo of it, but yeah, it's a crummy black and white photocopied photo from the 60s, so it's really hard to see what the hell we're looking at here. Fortunately, we have an illustration of what it might have looked like. And yeah, that looks even more like a tambourine, doesn't it? Weirdly enough, I couldn't find anything even close to this depicted in any art. All the drums I found look more like the one we saw on the Gallae funerary portrait. A round drum. Maybe this was like a makeshift sort of drum. That, plus the fact that Kybele herself is sometimes holding them, here she is seated in the chariot pulled by lions, makes me think the Gallae would more likely have used round drums, more like my snare here. Okay, so that's it with the drums. Let's head back to my study. Okay, great. So she likes drums, cymbals, and bassy flutes. That tracks with what we know about the worship practices of the Gallae. The poet Ovid describes a scene during the Megalensia, a festival devoted to Kybele, which took place on April 4th. Let the heaven's eternal axis turn 3 times, and Titan thrice hitch, thrice free his horses. Then the Barakintian flute's curved horn will blow, and the Idaean mothers' feast begin. The eunuchs will parade and pound the hollow drums, and their clashing bronze cymbals will ring. She will ride on the soft necks of her acolytes, howled along the city's major streets. The stage roars, the shows call. I have much to ask, but the strident cymbals clash and the claw pipe's chilling noise scare me. Barakintian is an epithet for Kybele, which refers to Barakintus, a mountain in Phrygia. Same with Idaean, which refers to Mount Ida, southeast of the ruins of Troy. That jives with the Homeric hymn as well. It talks about how Kybele likes hills and valleys. And of course, the eunuchs refers to the Gallae. I couldn't figure out what a claw pipe is, but the original Latin refers to a harsh sound in general. Maybe the translator is referring to an aulos. Now, the Romans really didn't like any of this. The poet Horace, a contemporary of Virgil and Ovid, he's the carpe diem guy, sees the fish or whatever, he describes the sound of the tambourine as saiwa, or cruel, and Ovid tells us they're inanis, or worthless. On the other hand, cymbals to Ovid teret, or are frightening, and the poet Propertius says they're rauca, or harsh. Seneca describes the sound of the horns in a similar way, while Lucretius says they feel threatening because of their raucisona cantu, or harsh sound. So music was an important part of the rituals of the Gallae. They played wind instruments and percussion, and apparently they also shrieked and screamed in imitation of the wolves and lions that Kybele liked, and in mourning for the dead Attis, but more on that later. There's another bit I want to pull from that Ovid quote though. She will ride on the soft necks of her acolytes, howled through the city's major streets. There are multiple references to their soft necks, which I guess was a sort of Roman shorthand for effeminacy, sort of like limp wrist might be today. But we actually have a depiction of this. It's on an altar the Gallae used, which again is such an awesome thing to discover. This object is currently in the Fitzwilliam Museum, part of the University of Cambridge. This side of it shows Kybele in the middle, flanked by 2 Gallae who were wearing Phrygian caps, like Attis. The way they're standing, it looks like they're mourning Attis, which was an important part of their practices. I said we'd get to that later, all right? Jeez, so impatient. Kybele herself is holding a branch in one hand and a bowl of fruit in the other, much like the Gallae portrait we looked at earlier, Nido. Another side shows that procession Ovid was talking about a moment ago. We can see 4 figures carrying some cult symbols of Kybele on a bier, which today I learned is the name of the thing a coffin rests on when you carry it in a funeral procession. They too are wearing Phrygian caps. In the middle of the bier, there's a big throne with a footstool. Kybele is shown sitting on top of a throne pretty regularly in Roman art. It shows up all the time. On top of the throne is a basket, which we figure is full of Kybele-related cult objects. There are 2 smaller Gallae on it too, which are probably sculptures and not actual Gallae. Unfortunately, it doesn't show them actually playing their instruments, but on the third side, there's a tree. The different Attis stories usually have a tree in them, with a drum, aulos, and cymbals hanging from it. So this altar would certainly have been a place where the Gallae offered up their worship to the great mother goddess. So 2200 years ago, trans girls were marching through the streets of Rome, making harsh noise music and weirding out everyone around them. Dolls who don't learn their history are doomed to repeat it, I guess. Chapter 5. Trees, Fruits, and Nocturnal Emissions. What else do we see on this portrait? In her left hand, she's holding a bowl of fruit and nuts, just like Kybele is on the altar we looked at a moment ago. It's easy to just accept that as a symbol of fertility, which makes sense for a mother goddess, and yeah, that's part of it. But also there are some almonds there, and that's an important bit as well. This ties into the mythology of Attis. According to the 2nd century CE Greek writer Pausanias, a monster named Agdistis was born after Zeus fell asleep and had a wet dream. Seriously, take this quote.
Zeus, it is said, let fall in his sleep seed upon the ground.
What else could that be? It's a wet dream. Incredible stuff. Anyway, it dripped down on the earth. I hate to be standing in the way of that one. And Agdistis popped out with 2 sets of genitals. They were just a little too chaotic for everyone to deal with, though. Sounds like some trans girls I know. So Dionysus tied her foot to her while she was sleeping. I'm not sure what he was planning to accomplish here, but when she woke up, she started thrashing around and freaking out and tore off her... yeah. It fell on the ground and an almond tree sprouted from it, because that's how things go in mythology. The almond tree grew and a young girl picked some almonds from it and put them down her shirt. They absorbed into her chest and impregnated her, and anyway, she gave birth to Attis. So almonds were an important symbol. Not a symbol, we talked about those already, a symbol for the cult of Kybele. Any ritual practices they had would almost certainly have involved almonds. What about what's in her other hand? That is 3 myrtle branches. Myrtle had a lot of different uses in Greco-Roman ritual, and I'm not going to get into all of it here, but it was associated with Venus since she was holding myrtle when she was born. It's also used when making a victory crown from a non-violent victory, like if you won at the Olympic Games. They were also worn to sacrifices or banquets. And in Rome, the Romans and Sabines were said to have purified themselves using myrtle when they joined forces and became one people. But also, E.M.W. Tilliard describes the branch of the Kybele altar we looked at earlier as a pomegranate branch, which is associated with Hades and Persephone and with fertility in general. None of that is really related to Kybele. I'm not enough of a horticultural archaeologist to really know which of these it is, or if it's even another branch altogether. Mary Beard says the mystery branch would have been used as a sort of sprinkler, though she doesn't elaborate, and I haven't been able to find any details beyond that. We do know the Gallae would sprinkle their blood on the statues and altars of the temple of Kybele, though, so maybe that's what it was used for. Chapter 6. Dixi Flagellato. Bene, Facere. We also see what looks almost like train tracks draped near her left shoulder. What's that? It's a whip, probably leather with knuckle bones weaved into it. The Gallae would have used that for self-flagellation, and the stick with a bearded head on either end of it is the handle. It's draped over her shoulder. The other Gallae statue we looked at, the full body one, also has a whip draped around the neck, which you can see if you look closely. When the Gallae prepared for their ritual castration, they would whip themselves until they bled using one of these things. Why? It's easy to just assume that this was an expression of self-hatred, which is what our ancient sources tell us. The Gallae would reenact the death of Attis, and part of that included lamentation at the act of self-castration, and, alright, that's one possible explanation, but we don't have any written sources from the Gallae themselves, only from observers and onlookers, most of whom didn't think too highly of them. Catullus, for example, in poem 63, talks about the Gallae in detail. The poem's final lines read, quote,
Great goddess, goddess Kybele, goddess dame of Dindymus, far from my home may all your anger be, O mistress. Urge others to such actions, to madness others hound.
In case that isn't clear based on the context, he's begging Kybele not to make him a Gallae. And this is one of the kinder treatments they receive in Roman literature, though Maybe least unkind might be a more accurate description. That poem is mostly focused on Attis as he castrates... It documents his journey through his gender confirmation surgery. And yeah, it does talk about how much he regrets it. Quote,
I was the gymnasium's flower. I was the pride of the oiled wrestlers. My gates, my friendly threshold were crowded. My home was decked with floral garlands when I used to leave my couch at sunrise. Now will I live a ministrant of gods and slave to Kybele. I, a maenad. I, a part of me. I, a sterile trunk. Now, I grieve the deed I've done. Now do I repent.
So the self-flagellation might have been an emulation of Attis's regret, or a way to channel their own regret into their rituals. But look, not to brag or anything, but I've met a lot of trans girls, and I don't know anybody who regrets transitioning. Girls who regret certain aspects of it, sure. Girls who wish they'd done it a little differently, absolutely. Girls who wish the people in their lives were better to them through the process, of course. Girls who wish the world wasn't so bloody hostile to us. But girls who regret the whole thing? No, I'm not saying detransitioning is not a thing. People do detransition, but look, the regret rates among trans people are really, really low. If you're trans, you know this already. But if you're not, you might have heard a lot of nonsense about how so many of us regret transitioning, and that just doesn't reflect reality. There's one paper in particular I want to talk about here. It's a meta-analysis, which is a type of study where researchers review a bunch of other papers on a topic to try and combine data points that match with each other. This can help you get a clearer picture on a topic, since larger sample sizes are in general a good thing for scientific research. Anyway, this paper by Bustos et al. Seems to be the largest on transition regret. It reviewed 27 different papers with combined 7,928 different trans people who'd gotten some sort of gender-affirming surgery. A third were transmasculine, the rest were transfeminine, and they looked at the rate of regret for these surgeries. They found 77 regretted getting their procedure. That's 77 out of 7,928. The study says that's less than 1%, but that's like saying Julius Caesar died more than 10 years ago. In fact, it's 0.0097%, less than 1/100th of 1%. And of that tiny number, more than a third expressed only minor regret. For comparison, another study, led by Carrie D. Solomon, found LASIK eye surgery has a regret rate of about 4.6%. As a result, they said, quote, LASIK surgery should be considered among the most successful elective procedures. So look, I'm not saying it's impossible that the Gallae regretted their transitions, but I don't trust non-Gallae to tell us about them in a way that's fair to their experience. Transfeminist writer Margaret Deidre O'Hartigan wrote a piece on the Gallae in a transfeminist zine called Trans Sisters back in the 90s, which is truly awesome. But she put the way I feel about this really, really succinctly. Quote, if there's one thing that having been both male and then female has taught me, it's that no one who has not gone through a similar transformation can be trusted to explain or speak for us. So I'm reluctant to trust what men have to say about the Gallae. Of course they'd be weirded out by it. They're men. Men don't like the idea of being women, just as women don't like the idea of being men. If you're a man who takes umbrage to that last statement, check in with yourself. You might not be as much of a man as you think. So what's the reason for the flogging? I'd like to present a possibility. The Dies Sanguinis, the Day of Blood, was celebrated on March 24th of each year. This was part of a long celebration of the Great Mother, which began on March 15th. We're going to get more into this in detail a little bit later. During the Dies Sanguinis, they would ritually castrate themselves, but they would also whip themselves until they bled. Then they would sprinkle the altars and icons in the temple of Kybele with their blood. Now look, when it comes to giving yourself the snip, even if you want to do it, it's going to hurt. A lot. What might you be able to do to relieve that pain? Well, the Romans did have painkillers. In fact, they had opium, which is what we use to derive a number of different pain-relieving medications today. We found capsules with opium residue inside of them throughout the Levant and Egypt. They're fairly consistent in design as well, which suggests there was actually a standardized system of production and distribution of the stuff. The Greek writer Dioscorides even tells us about the technique he used to harvest it, which is pretty fun. But they mostly either added a bit of it to their wine to use as a sleep aid, or took a lot of it to end their own lives, which wasn't considered a sin in the pre-Christian era. It might have been used for pain relief, but there isn't much in ancient literature about it, unfortunately. Even Paul of Aegina, a Byzantine doctor we talked about in the original video on eunuchs a while ago, doesn't mention it in his section about relieving pain. And even if the Romans did use it for pain relief, and to be clear, they may have, there's just very little in terms of literary references to it. Even if they did use it for pain, it might not have been easy to come by, especially for the Gallae, who by and large were confined to the temple of Kybele, except during the festival. Also, they might have used it. Again, there are very few references to opiates in the literature, and nothing at all from the Gallae themselves. We don't know. But that aside, what else might they have done to work themselves up to doing the deed? For this, let's take a look at a concept called conditioned pain modulation. I'm super not a scientist. I'm a classicist. This is my very basic understanding and interpretation of science. But if you know more about this stuff than I do and I'm off base here, please let me know. But basically, conditioned pain modulation is part of your body's pain control mechanism. When you experience two different types of pain, your brain perceives one of them as less painful. This might make sense to you intuitively. For example, my girlfriend told me when she gets dental work done, she sometimes digs her fingernails into her palm to try to distract from the feeling. I do the same thing during laser hair removal sessions. Could the Gallae have used a similar technique to control the pain during the dies sanguinis? Maybe. I don't have any sources I could use as evidence for this, but then again, we don't have any sources from the Gallae themselves at all. So unfortunately, that's gotta go in the maybe box. But still, it's important to note that self-loathing isn't the only possible explanation for the self-flagellation of the Gallae. In fact, there's another explanation as well. There are a whole lot of religious traditions that include self-flagellation, plenty of which are still around today. Some of these are based around Christianity and are practiced as a form of repentance. That's not self-hatred, though. Christians don't hate themselves, not by definition. It's a recognition of the sin inherent of all people and an attempt to purify their souls for Christ. But look, this video isn't about Christianity. Some pagan traditions will include self-flagellation in their worship practices as well. This is really not something I'm familiar with, so I do apologize if I get something wrong here. I'm not a Wiccan, so instead I'm going to rely on the words of Thista Minai, a queer writer about witchcraft. In her book, Casting a Queer Circle, Non-Binary Witchcraft, she takes a look at the use of the scourge, or whip, in ritual circles. Quote, "The scourge is a cross-quarter tool representing discipline and endurance. Ritual flagellation can be seen as a sort of counterpoint to the sacred meal. Both are concerned with the sacred potential of physical experience, but while ritual food and drink bring us nourishment and pleasure, scourging brings us insight gained through suffering. Pain applied skillfully, intentionally, consensually, and non-injuriously can be a powerful tool for personal revelation and transformation. Physiological responses to pain can help us break out of old mental habits, and inducing that state in a carefully crafted ritual atmosphere can let us replace self-destructive patterns with constructive thinking and new potential." It's interesting that Minai contrasts the use of pain with the pleasure of a feast, and we do know the Gallae took part in a feast shortly after they self-flagellated, and shortly after they were inducted into the order. We'll take a closer look at that later. So did the Gallae use self-flagellation in this way? Again, we don't know. I wish we had their thoughts on this. But the point is, the Gallae didn't necessarily practice self-flagellation because they hated themselves. I've provided two other possibilities here, and neither of which are even mutually exclusive. They could have worked together. Chapter 7. The March Festivals in Honor of Attis. Alright, so we have a bunch of elements of the worship of the Gallae. We even talked about one of the festivals, the Megalensia, on April 4th. But that's not the only festival we know of when it comes to their worship. Part of what we know comes from the Roman scribe Furius Dionysius Philocalus, who created a calendar for the year 354 CE, which outlined a whole bunch of different important dates in the Roman world. It's a pretty interesting little text. In particular, he tells us about some of the dates in March, which were part of a festival to Attis. The March festival, interestingly, seems like it may have replaced the April Megalensia we talked about earlier. Remember, the source we used for the Megalensia is Ovid's Fasti, which was written in the early 1st century, and Furius Dionysius Philocalus' work is from 354 CE. For comparison, imagine a festival in your country from the 1700s, if your country is even old enough to do that. If it's still being celebrated today, chances are it's changed at least a little bit since then. It's thought that the March festival, as we're about to explore it, properly coalesced during the reign of Antoninus Pius, who reigned from 138 to 161 CE, though it had probably been celebrated for centuries before then. Now, these festival dates follow the myth of Attis, so to properly understand them, I think it's a good idea to tell the tale of Attis. We talked about that one in the previous video on the Gallae and touched on it a bit earlier, but whatever, here it is again. A few different sources talk about it, but we have two key sources. One of them is Pausanias, a 2nd century CE Greek, who wrote a sort of travel guide to Greece of his day. We talked about him earlier. The other is Ovid's Metamorphoses, because of course it is. Anyway, they contradict each other in some ways, but here are the basic beats of Attis's life. Zeus had a wet dream, it dripped on the ground, and Agdistis, who remember was associated with Kybele, was born. Dionysus tied her to her foot, and she tore it off, from which an almond tree grew. A young maiden picked some almonds from the tree, put them down her shirt, which absorbed into her chest and impregnated her. She gave birth to Attis, and when she did, she abandoned him by a river. He was nursed by a goat before being found and raised by a shepherd family. He grew up to be hot, and Kybele/Agdistis fell in love with him. Remember, she's basically his grandmother. It's really weird, I know, but Greek mythology is full of this sort of thing. Anyway, Attis was into another girl, so Kybele was separated from her hot boy, which made her sad. So she did what any lovesick lady would do. She made him go mad and castrate himself. Then he collapsed under a pine tree and died. But she felt bad about it after, I guess, so Zeus made Attis immortal instead. So the festival days commemorated Attis's life. Let's take a look. Mensis Martius Quindecim. Cana Intrat. The first day of the festival was Cana Intrat, which fell on the 15th of March. You might recognize that day as the Ides of March, and you might think of it as the day a certain salad was skewered by several surly senators. The Ides of March sounds sinister to us because of Shakespeare's famous line, "Beware the Ides of March," in his play Julius Caesar, but it was just a day. Every month had an Ides. It's just how the Romans counted their days. The Ides of the month is in the middle of it, either the 13th or the 15th, depending on the month, corresponding with the full moon. The Nons corresponds with the quarter moon and shows up on the 5th or the 7th. And the calends is always on the 1st of the month, which is where we get the English word calendar. Anyway, Cana Intrat is Latin, which means the reed enters, as in reeds you find on the shore of a river, you know? This might commemorate the first day of Attis's life when he was abandoned by the river, but it might also symbolize his unfaithfulness to Kybele. Another group of followers of Kybele, the Canophori, or reed bearers, harvested some reeds and carried them through the city to the temple of Mater Magna. They also led a bull along in the process to be sacrificed to the goddess as a fertility ritual. This seems to have been a much more solemn procession. No screaming, no clanging. Either way, we think this ritual was established by the Emperor Claudius, who ruled from 41 to 54 CE. Were the Canophori Gallae? Are they the same thing? I can't find much information on them one way or another, but they seem to have admitted non-Gallae into their ranks as well, so at least some of them were not. After the Cana Intrat, there was a 9-day period of fasting and abstinence. They wouldn't eat bread, certain meats, and fruits, or drink wine. Some of the most devotees of Kybele and Attis would avoid these things altogether, but they were particularly important to avoid during the fast. This is supposed to represent the time where Kybele was denied the companionship of Attis. No mention is made of the Gallae at this point that I've seen, but they must have been a part of this festival. I mean, it's It's not like they have anything better to do, you know? They're the primary devotees of the Kybele and Attis cult. They must have done something here. Like, imagine a convent of nuns not doing anything for Easter, you know? Doesn't make any sense. Mencius martius vicinti duo, arbor intrat. So we know cana intrat means the reed enters. Can you guess what arbor intrat means? It's not a trick question. The tree enters, you know, like with Arbor Day, the tree day. Anyway, this is the day where the tree enters. Not the almond tree, though, the pine tree. You know, the one he died under after he wasn't approved for his GRS funding, so he chose a DIY approach? This one is led by another group, the Dendrophori, or tree bearers. They use the Greek word dendron, though, instead of the Latin arbor. I don't know why. Whatever. Anyway, the Dendrophori were mostly made up of people who worked in the Roman lumber industry, professional woodcutters and timber sellers. Early in the morning, before sunrise, they cut down a pine tree. They also sacrificed a ram and let its blood flow through the roots of the tree. Then we're told they attached an effigy of Attis to the tree with purple ribbons and carried it in a procession to the temple. But take a look at the altar we looked at earlier. The tree has a bunch of stuff hanging from it. Drums, cymbals, auloi. And this is clearly a pine tree, too. Look at how many pine cones there are in there. They decorated this thing like a Christmas tree. Y'all are going to start hanging Attis figures from your Christmas trees now, aren't you? I cannot be held responsible for the social contagion of trans girls who start hanging Attises from their Christmas trees. Anyway, afterwards, they laid the tree down in the temple in like a funeral style as though it were Attis. Then they began banging on drums and cymbals and shrieking and wailing in mourning over Attis's death. The primary sources I read don't say it specifically, but that's gotta be the Gallae. That's their MO. The Dendrophori were probably not Gallae, so it's more likely the Gallae were part of the ritual, but not the only ones, you know? Anyway, they did this all day long and into the next day, which would have set them back quite a bit in their voice feminization training, but I guess a priestess has gotta do what a priestess has gotta do, huh? Mensis martius vicinte tres. This one doesn't have a name. March 23rd was a day of mourning for Attis. There was a performance by the Salii, who were an order of priests devoted to Mars. They're referred to as jumping priests or leaping priests, so I guess they did like some sort of acrobatics along with their performance. Forget Cirque du Soleil, this is Cirque du Mars. March is named after the god Mars after all, so it makes sense he'd be involved in there somewhere, you know, paying tribute to his grandmother and all. They'd also blare their trumpets and beat their shields while they marched around the temple of Kybele, while the Gallae mourned from within. Maybe they even joined in on the jam session. I can't imagine the noise. Maybe it's like the air show. I always make a point to be out of town when Toronto's air show is on. If you lived near the temple of Kybele, maybe you'd take the opportunity to go visit your relatives in the country on March 23rd. Mensis martius vicinte quatuor.
Dies sanguinis.
Here we are. Skip this next part if you're squeamish. During the Dies Sanguinis, the Day of Blood, the Gallae would whip themselves until they bled. They might also beat themselves with pine cones and cut their shoulders, chests, or arms with knives. This, combined with not having eaten for 9 days, would have put them in a very intense state. Then they all partook in gender-affirming excision together and sprinkled their blood on the different sacred objects in the temple. That would include the altars and the effigy of Attis and, assumingly, the tree as well. Then they'd have their lower stomachs tattooed, probably with some images of Kybele and Attis. This inducted the new Gallae into the order. That night they carried the tree, remember it's supposed to represent Attis, on a bier and carried it to a grave where they buried it. They kept mourning and shrieking as they did so. I imagine their throats are pretty raw at this point. When the mourning finishes, a priest anoints their throats and says to them, quote, Farete mistai tu theon se sosminu estai gar emin ekponun soteria. Be of good heart, you novices, because the god is saved. Deliverance from distress will come for us as well. Mensis martius vicinti quinque. Hilaria. Rejoice, for he is risen. No, not Christ. That's on a different day, though, amusingly, I happened to have been writing that on Easter Sunday. Hilaria is a noun that means like merriment, rejoicing, joyous celebration, that sort of thing. March 25th commemorates the resurrection of Attis, which took place on the day after the spring equinox, the first day where the day is longer than the night. I know the spring equinox is usually on the 20th, but remember they hadn't invented the Gregorian calendar yet. The Roman calendar doesn't quite match up with ours. During this period, they'd have a triumph, which was a type of Roman parade usually reserved for generals who'd won an important military victory. The emperor would be at the head of the triumph, along with an idol representing Kybele and a bunch of expensive art and other stuff loaned by the local rich guys. That would make you look good. Following Kybele and the emperor were people of different social classes, including the upper class equites and senators, citizens, and freedmen. They'd be wearing all sorts of different masks and disguises, which is maybe why it was open to everyone. You might not know who was behind the mask. Behind them, the Gallae would be playing their drums, cymbals, and auloi, and when they got to where they were going, which isn't clear from what I read, there was a big feast. The quote from the Dies Sanguinis earlier might have happened on this day. It makes more sense based on context anyway. We're not sure. But there's another ceremony which may have taken place on this day or on the Dies Sanguinis. I'm talking about it here just to try and space things out a little bit. Anyway, we don't know much about the specifics of the rite itself, but we know it was sort of like a secret passage to enter. This was a common thing among ancient mystery cults. The Eleusinian Mysteries had a similar entrance ritual. That's another mystery cult if you're familiar with it. If you're not, don't worry about it. Anyway, there are a couple of different versions of this ritual, but they say more or less the same thing. Clement of Alexandria, an early Christian writer, gives us the most complete version, where he says, quote, "Ek tympanu ephagon, ek Kymbalon epion, ek urno foresa, upo ton paston upedun." From the drum I have eaten, from the cymbal I have drunk. I have carried the knowledge. The room I have entered. Firmicus Maternus tells us this was the phrase they used in order to be given entrance to the temple. He also adds, "I have become an initiate of Attis," to the end of this. And I think about this sort of thing sometimes, you know? Are you ever out somewhere and you see a chick who looks cool and you're pretty sure she's trans, but you don't want to say anything because, hey, I noticed you're trans is not a good icebreaker if she is trans, and really not a good icebreaker if you're mistaken and she's not, but also you don't really know what else to say, so you just gently smile at each other knowingly, sort of, but also not because, again, you're not sure. We do have the flag, but that's becoming more recognized and the world is becoming more... But our ancestors have given us a gift. Initiate of Attis. Sort of like the handkerchief code gay boys used to use, or calling each other a friend of Dorothy. Maybe Initiate of Attis can be a similar code word for us. I don't know. Mensis martius vicinte sex. Requieto. On this day, everyone rested because, oh my goodness, would they have needed it. There isn't much to say about this one, so I'm going to take this opportunity to have a rest because it takes a lot out of me to do this sort of filming. Catch you later. I'm going for a bike ride. Mensis martius vicinte septem. Lawatio. 1 hour later. That's better. Lawatio means bath, an appropriate activity after a sweaty bike ride. This was another very solemn, serious ritual. It involved another procession. The cult of Kybele loved its processions, where an archigallus would carry the Kybele stone in a chariot from the temple to the Almo, a small tributary of the Tiber River that flows through Rome. From there, he would dip the stone in the river and coat it with ash. He'd do the same with the other tools and religious items as well, within the chariot itself. Then he'd ask the Mater Magna if she wanted to return to Rome, and I guess she always did, because after that, they'd return her to the festival, but this time it was a much more festive procession. They'd dance along the way while being showered with flower petals. Scholar Martin J. Vermaseren says the return was a gay affair, which means this is evidence of the very first gay pride parade. Wow! Mensis martius vicinte octo. Initium Kayani. We know the least about this day. In fact, this one might not even be part of the festival of Kybele. There's just so little we know about it that I'm not going to get into it. There's just nothing... Chapter 8. what can this tell us? This festival was likely celebrated across the empire. There are a few different ways we know this. First of all, there are plenty of cult icons and altars to Kybele, which we found across former Roman territory. This includes modern-day Turkey, which is not at all surprising since the Gallae came from there originally. There are also a bunch from Athens, many of which were discovered in Piraeus, which was Athens's port town. This one was found along the Via Appia, a road going from Rome through the south of Italy. Take a look at the tree and what's hanging from it. That's an Attis tree, absolutely. Here's the entrance to a shrine dedicated to Attis in Ostia, a port town near Rome, and a statue of Attis reclining from within the same shrine. Here's a fresco of a procession in honor of Attis from Pompeii. Could some of the people in the audience here be Gallae? Maybe. Here's a silver dish from near Mediolanum, modern-day Milan. There's Kybele and beautiful Attis by her side in a chariot being pulled by lions. Here's a marble relief showing the death of Attis, which was found in Glanum, a bit south of Avignon in France. Here's a sarcophagus depicting an archigallus, the high priest of the Gallae, who, remember, was not an actual Galla. This one was found near Porto in Portugal. This one's from Porto as well. It's an archigallus honoring Attis. This one has Kybele along with Hermes and Hecate. It's from Egypt. This one's from near Dusseldorf, and this one's from Trier. Here's an Attis from Andetrium, which is in modern-day Croatia. And here's one from Tomis, modern-day Constanta in Romania. It's where Ovid lived out his final years after being exiled from the empire. The Kybele cult made its way out there as well. You get the point. We found evidence of the cult of Kybele and Attis all over former Roman territory. But that isn't necessarily evidence the Gallae were there. After all, there were non-Gallae Romans who paid tribute to the Mater Magna as well. Remember the Dendrophori, for example, and the Canophori. But that's not all we have. We've also discovered a grave in Britain with clear evidence it belongs to a Gallae priestess. We won't go in depth into that today. That deserves its own video, and this one is already long enough. But it's pretty wonderful that such a thing exists. So that tells us the Gallae did have a presence outside of Rome. The literary evidence can help us too. In fact, it's none other than St. Augustine who tells us about them. St. Augustine was an early Christian figure whose philosophical writings ended up greatly influencing the theological underpinnings of the church. If you were to make a list of the most influential Christians of all time, obviously Jesus is number one, but St. Augustine would be on there for sure. Born in the year 354 CE, he eventually became the bishop of Hippo, a city in Roman North Africa, in modern-day Algeria, before dying in 430 CE. He wrote a number of different texts, but his most famous one is De Civitate Dei contra Paganos, on the city of God against the pagans. We usually just call it City of God. He sets aside an entire chapter of Book 7 to rail against the Gallae and the cult of the Great Mother, which opens with, quote,
"Concerning the Gallae consecrated to the same Great Mother, in defiance of all the modesty which belongs to men and women, Varro has not wished to say anything, nor do I remember to have read anywhere aught concerning them. These Gallae, no later than yesterday, were going through the streets and places of Carthage, with anointed hair, whitened faces, relaxed bodies, and feminine gait, extracting from the people the means of maintaining their ignominious lives."
A lot to pick through there, and perhaps I'll do more if I ever do a video addressing ancient transphobia. But for our purposes today, it's noteworthy that St. Augustine saw the Gallae in Carthage parading through the streets and asking for donations, just like we know they did in Rome as well. So we do have clear evidence the Gallae had a wide-ranging presence across the ancient Mediterranean. The cult of Kybele and Attis was practiced broadly, including the festivals devoted to them. But when you look at that St. Augustine quote, it's pretty clear how much disdain he has for the Gallae. And he's not alone there. In fact, one of the great ironies I found while researching and writing this video was how many of the sources we have about the Gallae are openly hostile to them. Firmicus Maternus, for example, gives us the closest thing we have to a direct quote from the Gallae. But before he does so, he says, quote,
They have a particular sign and a particular response in which instruction of the devil is transmitted to them in the meetings of these very sacrileges.
Now, the Gallae were practicing a religion, it's true, and modern trans girls, by and large, aren't. He also lived during the reign of Constantine I, when Christianity was absolutely still an underdog and had been persecuted for centuries. Constantine put an end to that persecution, but that wouldn't have put an end to anti-Christian attitudes any more than the 13th Amendment in the United States abolished racism. So in one respect, it's understandable that he would think terribly highly about pagans. That said, if you know anything about moral panics, I'm sure you'll recognize some of the ingredients here. The work of Firmicus Maternus is called De Errore Profanarum Religionem, on the error of the profane religions. And the word profane had similar connotations in Latin as it does in English today. Unclean, offensive, wicked, the one word that is actually similar. So that's very similar to St. Augustine's work, not just on the city of God, but on the city of God against the pagans. Clement of Alexandria, too, gives us some important details on their worship, and he is perhaps even harsher. Just before he tells us the secret password of the Gallae, he says, quote,
If I go on to further quote the symbols of initiation into this mystery, they will, I know, move you to laughter, even though you are in no laughing humor when your rites are being exposed. Are not these symbols an outrage? Are not these mysteries a mockery?
Harsh, right? But here's the thing. If it weren't for these guys and their desire to condemn the Gallae and their rituals, we wouldn't know many of the details we know about them today. They wanted to crush the Gallae, and now we're talking about them because of their words. So there's that. Maybe along with the rest of this video, that can bring you some comfort as well. Yes, qui oderunt, those who hate, refuse to shut up about us. They rant about us nonstop, constantly spreading awful lies about us to rile up their base. If the multimillionaire pundits can get the unwashed masses to spend their energy hating a stranger, that helps distract them from the thousands of ways their billionaire masters are screwing everybody, every single day. But our trans siblings looking back on this time, thousands of years in the future, might see the likes of Matt Walsh, Ben Shapiro, or Donald Trump, and learn about us in that way. And as sickening as that might seem, the fact that they can't shut up about us ensures that we'll be remembered. Similarly, we don't know much about the Tectosages because nobody wrote much about them. I mentioned them in the video on the Enaree grave, and somebody in the comments became very cross because I deliberately pronounced their name wrong because I thought it was cool. So here you go. I'm saying it right this time. May the Tectosages forgive me for my grave indiscretion. Huh, get it? Anyway, trans people today, of course, have plenty of writings and YouTubings, so our future siblings will have more than just the opinions of phobes to lean on. But to borrow the words of trans feminist Margaret Deidre O'Hartigan once more, quote, "When I look upon the image of a Gallae carved in stone for the Appian Way, I have no doubt that I gaze upon the image of a woman in whose features I recognize my own, and whose life more closely resembles mine than do either of ours, to the majority of our respective contemporaries. In that instant I sense that, although 1900 years may separate us, she is my sister, and I am hers, and in that sense we are both priestesses of the Great Mother. We have both been male, and become female. The power brokers of the world are working hard to isolate us from each other, from ourselves, from our history, but they were wrong in antiquity, and they're wrong today. Today, we dug a lot more in depth into the worship practices of a sect of trans feminine priestesses, the Gallae. I hope this helps connect you to those who came before us. But when it comes to their rituals, there's a lot we don't know. So if you were considering a ritual approach to honoring our transcestors, you might find some gaps and feel tempted to add your own details in. That is, in fact, in keeping with the traditions of the Gallae in the first place. We know their rituals changed over time, with new festival days and new worship practices. The emperors Claudius, Domitian, and Antoninus Pius, at least, are all known to have played a role in shaping the cult of Attis and Kybele, and the Emperor Julian the Apostate wrote about the March festivals as well. Each of these emperors would have left their mark on the festival, and assumingly the Gallae themselves would have found different ways to pay tribute to their patron deities as well. So if in your own life you're feeling isolated and alienated from your ancestors, perhaps these rituals can bring you some comfort as you gaze into the eyes of the sculptures of our ancient trans sisters. May you realize the truth that can't be buried, no matter how hard they try. We have always existed. And so long as humanity continues to endure, so too shall we. Thanks everyone for watching, if you made it this far. One of these days I'm going to learn how to be more concise, but that is not today. As usual, this video took longer than anticipated, so sorry for taking so long, but I hope you liked it anyway. And if you did, like it below, comment, subscribe, all that fun stuff. And special thanks to the channel's Patreon backers and members.